Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Morales, and I am your host for In My Feels But I'll Feel podcast. And I am excited to be here with you today with my wonderful guest, Monica. And so I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Monica Hinostroza. And I'm really excited to be here with you today.
Yes, and thank you for coming. She traveled such a long way for us to be here and have her in our seat. But I very much appreciate her taking the time, the consideration. And so I'm interested to know whenever I opened up the application, what encouraged you to fill it out?
I think that obviously I support your mission. I support your goals. And I think that one thing that we need in our community is to talk about mental health and a lot of aspects of it that we usually don't. And we try to, push it under the rug and we try to ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. And I think that it's really important to address these things. And the fact that you're doing that on a podcast where you can bring real people on who have real life experiences, I think that is what we need in our community.
Thank you. And that's what In My Feels But I'll Heal podcast is about. It's everyday common people going through their healing journeys. It's not us meant to be perfect or to already be healed, but it's for us to recognize that I'm still working at it and it's an everyday challenge and maybe I've overcome this, but I'm still working on this. But today's biggest topic that we will be talking about is grief. The hardships around grief, our process around grief, the testimonies around grief. And this is a subject that I very much hold dear to me because it's something I've experienced in a very young age at different phases. And it's something that we can never escape because we're all deemed to death at one point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that at one point or another, we're all going to have to face grief. We're all going to have to experience it. And you don't know how you're going to react to it until it happens, for sure.
And it's difficult to come to those points where, depending situationally, like who it is that you're grieving for, that it's going to affect you differently. And so definitely for me, like my grandma in the 2000s, and then I felt like every couple years, it's like 2 to 3 deaths a year, a friend having cancer, suicide, some type of illness, or a traumatic incident. So it's something that I've never really escaped, and I know I won't escape. But maybe I feel like I've normalized it because of how frequent I've had to go through it. Now, don't mind, like I haven't lost a dear parent, and when that day comes, I can only imagine. But for you, what is your grief?
Yeah, so when I was 22, this was 5 years ago, almost 6 now, that my dad passed away. And it wasn't unexpected in the way that we didn't know it was coming, but he was sick for a few years before that. And even though something's coming, when you experience a family member who's sick, it's going to happen. The day that it comes, it's still the biggest shock of your life. And even though you think like, okay, mentally you've told yourself, you've prepared and you've thought, okay, I know this day is going to come. And then you get there and you're like, why am I surprised? Why am I shocked that I'm feeling this way when I knew it was coming? But it's because you cannot fathom grief until they're actually gone. As much as you think you mentally prepare yourself for it, you can't.
Yeah.
It's something that your mind can't process.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you know that your father was sick, and what was the turning points that you're like, this is really going to happen now?
Yeah, so he had dealt with liver disease caused by alcoholism for about 4 years. And it was around the time I went to college that he started showing symptoms of it. My last year of college was when he went to the hospital and they told us, they said, if he stops drinking right now, he can still live another 5 to 10 years. And I thought, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the point where he will say, okay, I'm done. Maybe he wants to live 5 or 10 more years. But, the thing about addiction and drugs or alcoholism is that it's hard. I can imagine it's hard to stop. And he didn't. And so after that, he lived about 9 more months. Mm-hmm. And then that's when he passed away.
Yeah. And that's very hard. And my condolences to you for having to lose a major identity role of a person in your life, because this is your father, somebody that birthed you. Was there any feelings that you were conflicting to you, him choosing not to stop?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And that was so hard. So I had graduated college in May, and then in September, he passed away. So I was just adjusting to life. I had just got my first job, And I was really excited about it, being an adult, being a grown up for the first time. And then I had to go back home. And I was really upset because I never felt like I had that support because he couldn't be there, because of alcoholism. He wasn't really a present dad. But going home and him being sick, and then it was actually Labor Day. And I was like, okay, like he looks really bad, but like, okay, maybe we have time. And then the next day I woke up in the middle of the night and he was gone. And so it just so happened that I had been there that weekend for Labor Day, and he died that day. And so
you woke up because news, or your body physically woke up?
No, so my brother was screaming, and then I obviously ran over there, and then we had to call the ambulance and everything. And it was crazy that I was there that weekend and I had to stay, and I had to call my job and be like, yo, like, I know it's Labor Day weekend, like this happened and I don't really know how to process it, but I know that I had to tell you that I can't go to work. And that was all I could say because I was in shock. And even when we got to the hospital and they told us like, yeah, he's gone, I was still in shock. And, that's that thing about grief that I told you. I was like, well, I knew it was coming. I knew he was sick. I knew he wasn't feeling well. So why am I so surprised, right? But it was really complicated because I was really angry. And I felt bad for feeling angry. I felt guilty for feeling angry. I felt guilt because I was, the daughter that went to college. I left and I started a life in Austin, and I would come back a lot, but still like I had left.
So was it guilt that you had left and you were absent in those times?
Yeah. I think I felt really bad that I wasn't there all the time when he was sick, even though I went home every 2 weeks. Still, I felt like I wasn't doing enough, and I think that comes with that immigrant mentality, like being raised by immigrant parents and feeling like you're not doing enough as the only daughter. I was the only daughter to my mom and my dad. So I didn't feel like I had done my job, if that made sense. Yeah. And then after he passed,
that you hadn't done it, or you hadn't completed what you were going to do for them.
Yeah, because I felt like, why didn't I do enough? Like, was there something I could have done to make him stop drinking? Was there something I could have done to help him while he was sick? What could I have done differently? How could I have supported him more? And these are all things that come after, when like you feel so guilty for the fact that they were sick in the first place and that there's nothing you could do. And I think that also comes from just being like that human part of you that you're like, someone that I love is sick and there's nothing I can do about it.
Wow.
100. I'm just like, what do you mean I can't do anything about it? Like I want to fix it. And I couldn't do anything about it.
Your hands are tied. You get to a point where there's nothing more I can do. Like the best medical doctors or individuals that are supposed to help him, they've already said this is it. And it's hard. So was he in hospice care by the point he was home? Or?
No, he didn't want to be. He just wanted to be home.
He just wanted to be home.
And after that hospital stay, he was like, don't ever take me back there again. I don't want to be there. I just want to be at my house. And we had to respect that. And there was nothing I could do about that. And we just tried to make him as comfortable as we could. And it was really complicated because, like, I look at my mom and I looked at my brother and I was like, there's nothing. Like, we just kind of watched someone die and you're left with all of these feelings. And it's like, why didn't he want to stay? And I know that's complicated, but like, why didn't he want to stay? Why didn't he want to be here? Why didn't he want to fight, Yeah. And then I felt guilty for feeling that way because I'm like, he was sick and I'm over here feeling bad and feeling angry at him for not fighting more, for not for being an alcoholic and not being able to stop that addiction.
Did you feel like it was selfish on him for not considering all these things you were considering?
Definitely. I think that now as a parent too, even though I've dealt with a lot of the grief, I still feel that way sometimes because there isn't anything I wouldn't do for my child.
Right.
And I think that was one of the first things I thought when I had my daughter and I looked at her, I was like, I would do anything for her. And then having to process that grief, first of all, that my dad wasn't here to see my daughter. And, she wouldn't have one grandfather. And then being like, why couldn't he have done this, for me? So it's definitely super complicated. And that kind of feeling never really goes away. But I think at the time when you first experience grief and you're processing, it's really heightened and you feel it so strongly that it kind of consumes you. And some people...
What does that consumption look like? Because I feel like we tend to not recognize like because there is such diagnoses as like prolonged grief and complicated grief because there is like some time mark scientifically that's like 6 months to a year, and it's not to say like you should be getting over it, but it's like you're able to go back to coping with life and getting back to a level of normalcy. And then there's times where you get stuck. How was your time span between then to now?
Right. So I think the first 2 months I was just kind of in a state of shock. I mean, I cried a little bit, but I had trouble being around people and processing that. So I just kind of wanted to be alone. And I had to go back to Austin to my job eventually. And it felt like life kept moving, but I didn't know how to. And so I felt stuck. And I had never experienced that kind of loss before, that kind of grief. So I didn't know how to deal with it. Thankfully, though, I was in therapy, and I avoided it for like the first 3 months. So I was like, I don't want to talk about it. And then she was like, we need to talk about it. And then I was like, okay.
So you were going to therapy and avoiding the topic?
No, I wasn't going for
or you
3 months.
Avoided therapy because you just didn't want to talk about
I stopped seeing my therapist because I was like, I don't want to deal with it. Like, I already know she's going to tell me some real stuff, and I don't want to hear it. And, at the time, like, I couldn't. Like, my mind couldn't process anything other than my dad is gone, and I feel everything. And then the first 3 months, it was like that for me. I avoided it. I was feeling really sick, even physically. I had so many symptoms. Like, I had dealt with high blood pressure, which isn't something, like I was young. I had never dealt with that before. I was having like heart palpitations. I kept getting sick. And I was like, I was super anxious, super obviously depressed. And that wasn't something that I was ready to face until I went back to therapy, and we had a lot of conversations, and I actually got to a point that I got so low and I felt so badly that I knew that I needed help. And it was like a wake up call for me.
Yeah.
And this was like after the 6-month mark. So I had been going to therapy for the last 3 months, but then I was like, something is really wrong. Like, I can't move on. I can't move forward, like,
and how was it presenting itself in your life? Because you kind of said you felt really low, but what did that look like externally?
So I would just go to work, and even then I would barely, be paying attention, and they noticed too.
Like very absent.
Yeah, definitely. And I was showing up late, and I was trying to leave early, and I wasn't really there. And then I would go home, and I would drink, and I would I don't know if I can say this on here.
Go ahead. Okay. No, smoke.
I would just smoke a lot of weed, like a lot, like too much, because I didn't want to feel. And that's the reality of it. I was numbing myself to try to escape that feeling, because at 22 too, I was like, I don't know how to deal with it. And I didn't want to deal with it. It was a fact. Like, I didn't want to deal with it. And then my body, again, physically started presenting symptoms, and it made me think, crap, like I have to face it. Like, there's no way out but through. And I had to do something about it. So one night my depression got so bad. I wasn't sleeping. I had insomnia. And like I said, I was barely focusing at work. And
who were you living with at this time, or where were you living?
I was living in Austin with my best friend, Gabby.
Okay.
And so we were both working and pretty busy at the time. So I wouldn't always see her. Okay. And then I was also trying to stay busy and avoid, being home. And when I was home, I was just drinking a lot of wine. And again, just smoking a lot of weed, trying not to pay attention to it and just ignore it. And then it came to a point where one night I was like, I don't really want to be here anymore. Like, I don't really want to be alive anymore. And in that moment, I knew that like it could only go one of two ways. It was either like I was going to do something and hurt myself, or I could get help. And I called my therapist, and it was probably like 11 o'clock at night. Bless her heart. She was great. And she was like, I think we need to get you some help. And that night I went to actually a clinic, and they immediately put me on Xanax. They were like, you need to chill. You need to calm down. We need to give you this so that you can calm down first.
Were you fighting it, or did you take it? You were like, whatever.
No, I took it immediately because I was having a mental breakdown. I was crying. I was panicking. I had an anxiety attack, and I couldn't function, and they saw that. And then I told them, I was like, my dad died recently, and I don't know how to deal with it. And they came back literally with the pill, and they were like, you need to take this right now. And I didn't realize till after that it was Xanax, and they were like, you need to relax, you need to calm down. And then we'll prescribe antidepressants. We'll get you a psychiatrist, and, you have your therapist. And if you need more, if you need to be, in a facility, then we can do that too. And obviously I didn't want that. So I was like, okay, let me deal with it then, I guess. Let me start taking the steps to fix it, to do what I can do. And I did get on antidepressants immediately, and I started taking therapy very seriously, and my therapist noticed too. And only then, I think after 6 months, did I start actually moving forward.
So that it's interesting that you're talking about your shift in being in counseling? Because you said you were already seeing your counselor for 3 months, but it wasn't until a little bit after that 3-month mark that you had a shift. And so you would have thought that me going into therapy, it should have been at the start of the 3 months.
Right. Yeah, I think you want to think that just going to therapy is going to fix some things. But when you experience, when you already deal with it, like I had already been dealing with depression and anxiety. So after this happened, I realized that it wasn't just enough for me to, have a therapist and talk to them and take the steps that I could in that way. I needed actual help. I needed some kind of medication to help me. And sometimes that's what it takes. And I had been on antidepressants in the past and I had weaned off.
Yeah.
And I was doing well. And then something like this can happen and you are right back at square one and you have to start over.
Yeah.
And I was scared of that. I was scared of starting over with my mental health and being at that level of point. And you don't realize it until you're in it. And then you get on antidepressants and you're like, dang, I feel so much better. Like, obviously you're not perfectly better, but you feel like you can manage it.
Yeah.
You feel like you can actually talk about it and process things that you can't really do when you're in the midst of such a huge mental kind of breakdown.
And thank you for shedding light to that, because a lot of people try to shy away or want to kind of be reluctant into taking medication. Yeah. But if you are having some type of severe mental health symptom and it is controlling your life and you cannot function, medications allow you to get things done more productively. And it's not to say that it's fixing it, but it just allows some of the emotional reactions to kind of ease off so you can talk about it, so you can sit down, so you can process, so you can go to work, so you can just function back to normal until you start really getting to the nitty gritty.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what it was. I was on antidepressants for a year and a half after that. And so about 2 years after my dad died, I started working with a psychiatrist to wean off, and I did it, in the proper way. And I was fine. I was in a good place, and I'm really grateful that I could come off of my antidepressants. And it was easier to do that time and not feel like, okay, I'm going to go right back into my depression. And I didn't. I was doing really great. And I'm really grateful that I did get on antidepressants and that I stayed in therapy too.
So was there any point where you felt that, because you kind of mentioned being hopeful, that you got the help and you were able to wean off, was there any point where you're like, this is going to be my life? Like me being sad?
Oh yeah, for sure. Those first 6 months, I was like, I'm never going to be the same again. I'm always going to feel this way. And part of it is true. Part of it is you're never going to be the same again. And you kind of are also grieving that person that you were before you experienced this level of grief, because there's no way for you to go back to being that person that you were before you lost someone this important to you. There's no way you can go back to not knowing that level of guilt and that level of sadness. But I think at the time I was like, this is all I am now. This is all I'm ever going to be. Instead of this is a part of me and this is something that I can work through. And this is something that I can turn into just making myself stronger and making myself more resilient to the fact that stuff like this is going to happen.
Yeah.
You're going to grieve and it's going to happen again, to all of us. But I think that it took a lot, obviously, for me to get to a point where I was like, I'm always going to be sad about the fact that my dad is gone. But that doesn't mean that I always have to be sad. It doesn't mean that I always have to be depressed. It was a lot of understanding the fact that grief was always going to be with me. And I'm always going to feel a hole and like this void in my life where he should have been. But now, after 5 years, and again, it's been a while, so it's taken a long time to get here. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with that void, because it means that he was here and that he was alive. And I'm grateful to have been able to love someone so deeply that they always left this kind of hole in my life, And I think that is really what grief is at the end of the day, is all this love that you have for someone that you can no longer give to them.
Express.
Yeah,
to them.
You can't hug them, you can't kiss them, you can't tell them that you love them. So what do you do with it,
Yeah.
So that is grief. It is all that love that you have for someone that you can't do anything with.
And we've kind of mentioned this before and in our previous conversations, is that everybody processes grief differently. And so sometimes grief might present itself as being angry. Sometimes grief might represent itself as maybe the person is lashing out, or they're being super spontaneous and now they're traveling, but they're trying to get away from some type of feeling and emotion, or they're processing through it. It looks like crying. Sometimes people humor through grief. And so maybe the only way that I am able to process is by laughing at some silly remark or some silly memory. And it doesn't mean they don't care, but it just means that everybody process grief differently. And I feel like that's hard for some people. If you process grief in this specific way and somebody else in the family is not, you're thinking, man, you didn't even care. You didn't even give a fuck. But in reality, that wasn't the truth. I just processed my grief differently.
Very differently. Yeah, I think that all of us in my family definitely had a different reaction. And a lot of them was very, outwards with it. Like, they were crying kind of stuff. But I couldn't really express my grief that way at the time. And it wasn't to say that I wasn't, crying behind closed doors or like on my own. But it was hard for me to grieve in front of people, in front of my family. So I wanted to do that kind of on my own. And especially after that shock had worn off. So it took me a while to get to a point where I felt like, okay, I'm allowed to cry. And I'm allowed to be angry. And I was so mad. I was so mad for a long time. Just that, not only like my dad for not being here, but at life for being so cruel and being this way. And at the time, I was like, life is messed up. And in reality, that's just life, But at the time, I was really angry and upset at everything and everyone. And obviously, that's a part of the grief. And then it got to a point where, I feel like it just turned into just sadness.
And that's something we talked about too. Is like these emotions can coexist where you are sad and you are angry, because the truth is, yes, Dad, I am angry you left me, and but I'm also sad you're gone. These emotions can coexist, and it's hard to feel that they can coexist without feeling guilty at one or the other. Like, how can I be angry at somebody that just passed? But it's like I am angry because now I'm left with all these emotions and feelings. And so, how has that dynamic change over time in your family? Because I feel like whenever I think about grief and in family grief, we think about the responsibilities that person left, and like, who's going to look after mom? Who's going to look after this?
Oh, yeah.
How was that for you?
So everything definitely fell onto me, but I kind of expected that. Like, my brother, whenever my dad passed, was not able to function, and he kind of hid away from everyone and everything, and he just didn't want to deal with it at all. I couldn't interfere with his journey, but that meant that I had to plan the funeral. I had to plan the services. I had to contact everybody. I had to figure out how to get the money. I had to be there for my mom and somehow find time to manage my own grief. And then his mom, my grandma, was still alive at the time. So I had to be there for her and, be there for his sisters. And, like, everyone needed something from me. And I didn't feel like I had time to grieve myself. So I had to take over the responsibilities. And then after the services were done, it was now like, oh, my mom is alone. And I know that either way, I was always going to be there for my mom. And I always wanted my mom to be with me. But it was, a lot more serious.
Yeah.
Because she didn't have anyone else to lean on and that would be there for her. So even more so, I felt like I had to step up,
And that's interesting that you're mentioning this, because there is, I wonder how much of you having to push away these emotions of dealing with the grief had to do because you were involved in the preparation. So it's like, I don't have time to think about it. Like, and it's sad too, because you are not given the space to properly grieve, because you're having to fix some of the timing, the scheduling, the where's the money coming from, los arreglos, like all those things.
Yeah, I think that's also probably, like a cultural thing, like the oldest daughter duties, and it comes with the position. And it's also like, I didn't feel like I could grieve until I got back to Austin, and I went back to, having to be, normal. And that was when I got to my apartment and I was alone. That was like the first time I felt like, okay, I can break down, I can grieve and feel the way that I haven't been able to feel the last 2 weeks that I was home. Because we also did a novenario. And that's, 9 days of praying and feeding people and having to talk to people. And I'm not the kind of person that can cry in front of people like that. So I was also not like comfortable just coming to anyone and being like, I'm not feeling well. Like, I need help. Like, I could not do that. That's definitely the pride.
So you bottled up in between all that time.
Oh, yes. And then it, it exploded. And I think that's what happens when you bottle up any emotion. Eventually it gets too much and it forces you to either, you get into a really bad position, or you decide that you want to fight and you want to deal with it.
Yeah. And so whenever I was experiencing some moments of really heavy grief with a personal friend loss, I noticed that even throughout the years, even throughout the time, like it would hit me with a wave. Like I would hear a song, I would remind myself of something or something would happen and I would just cry by myself.
Yeah.
Did you experience any of that?
Yeah, I think that I always will. I think that I will always feel that way. And like I said, I think that that's another aspect of grief, and that's something that happens once you've initially processed it. After a few years, you come to, again, be okay with it because, I mean, you don't really have another choice. So you have to be okay with it, and something will inevitably come up, either whether it's like their birthdays, you know, the day that they died, the holidays, and a song, something you see. My dad was a huge Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so anytime I see anything Steelers, I'm like, oh, you know, there's my dad. Like, he loved that. And now I feel like I turn it into humor, and like I can laugh about it, and I can be happy, and you know, at the reminder, because it also means to me that my brain isn't forgetting him, and I will always have those memories, even though I think that's also a really complicated thing. Like, your brain knows that this person was here, but they're not here anymore. So it's like, it confuses you, and you have to kind of learn how to deal with the memory of them. And I think that it's beautiful when I hear my dad's favorite songs come up, it makes me so happy because I'm like, oh, like that's just a constant reminder to me that he was alive and I loved him.
And so is there any ways that you honor your dad today that kind of help you, or things that you do within a year?
Yeah, I still have an altar for him. I usually have it year round.
And can you tell us what an altar is for those that don't know what an altar is?
Yeah, an altar is something in Mexican culture. Usually we celebrate on Dia de los Muertos, but a lot of the time people will have it year round for their family members who passed away. You have their picture, you have candles, you can have some of their favorite things. Like I usually have a beer there for my dad because I'm like, well, again, there's a humor. I'm like, well, it already killed you. So like, you know, you can have a beer now, I guess. And some of his favorite things. And then I leave it around year round. And I will randomly put a candle up. I'll put, you know, lights on it. And then obviously for Dia de los Muertos is when I really go all out and I try to make it really big.
That's really beautiful. And I think that's the important part of grief too, is finding healthy ways to remember our loved ones, ways that you are still able to function, that you're able to hold dear to memories, but have pleasant experience with the ways you choose to remember them. Because if you don't, then you'll just always carry around a weight of negativity, a weight of loss, a weight of grief. Yeah, that's really beautiful.
I think that that's how you know that you're on the other side of grief now. You know, you're not necessarily in that side that just seems like it's never going to end. You're on that just accepting stage where you're like, okay, like I'm going to have to live my life and I'm going to have to deal with it. And that doesn't mean that I didn't love him or that I forget him. It just means that I am figuring out my way around it.
Yeah. So is there anything that you learned about yourself in this process of going through grief?
I think that very few things have made me mature more than grief. I don't think that, obviously, like even being in the culture, being Mexican, growing up as the only daughter, you mature so quickly, you grow up so quickly. But experiencing grief, then you mature so much because there's so many emotions that you have never experienced before that you're forced to experience and deal with, that then, again, like I said, you will never not know what that feels like. And it made me so much more empathetic, obviously, because I can relate to people who have faced an immense grief before. And it also made me just appreciate life and my friends and my family so much more. And I think that I take it very seriously, my love that I have for the people that I care for. And I'm sure my friends are like, you're so you're so caring, and you're always telling us how much you love us. But it's because I know what it's like to lose somebody. Yeah. And I know what it's like to lose the person that you love and never seeing them again. And it's like a lot of people at our age don't fully understand it because, you know, we're young, and grief for a lot of us doesn't come till later in life. But because I had to deal with it, it has made me love my friends so deeply. And it makes me tell the people that I love every day how much I love them and appreciate them. And it makes me appreciate life. And especially now with my daughter, it makes me hopeful.
Yeah,
for sure.
And I like that you mentioned that just the more gratitude and appreciation, an expression that you've had for your friends and your loved ones. And even you saw me tell my brother I love you before he left. It wasn't always that way. For me and my siblings and my parents, we were pretty cold. We would have our conversations and would be like, okay, bye. It was never, I love you. And I remember having this conversation with, it started with one of my siblings and telling him, if I died and would you recognize that you had never told me you loved me? Would you have been okay with that? And I think it snapped for him and he got it. He said, no, I wouldn't be okay. And so we started saying, I love you. And it started with me and one of my siblings, and it started with me and the rest of my siblings. And then it started with the brothers and themselves. And now my mom and I and my dad and I, and now every single conversation's like, okay, I love you. Okay, love you. Like now we're hourly expressing I love you. But I think it's important to understand just because it's not normalized doesn't mean you cannot change the narrative to make it normal. It is going to feel uncomfortable because it's something that you've never practiced. It's never you've done. Like, where is this coming out of? But it's like, nah, I want to let you know that I do appreciate you because God forbid something ever did happen.
I think we're in a culture that that's a little bit apathetic and is a little bit like, again, expressing your emotions isn't always cool. But then something happens and it feels too late, like I wish I would have had one more day to tell my dad how much I loved him. And I did tell him that night before he passed, but like now that doesn't feel like enough, So when I see my friends, I'm always like, I love you. I'm like, you better say it back. Because you never know. And once you know what it's like to lose somebody, you fear it, like obviously, of course, anyone would fear losing someone that they love, but you know the feeling too well. And you're like, like you said, I don't want to for something to happen and then them not know how much I love them.
And you kind of mentioned throughout our conversation some of the cultural aspects. So is there anything specific from our culture and grief that you usually see together? And I know it's very different, especially depending on what kind of religion usually we fall into that we're practicing. So you said like the novenario is like some of that, but the culture has a lot to do with it. Sometimes it's like how you process it, how it's presented in the culture, like what's expected of you during that time. Like, are other people expecting you to be sad? So therefore you feel like you need to be sad.
I do think that being here, especially in America, capitalism and colonization play a huge role in how we grieve because after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, the world is like, okay, get back to work. Ponte las pilas and get back to it. And you can't, like obviously you go, like I said, I went back to work, but I wasn't there mentally. I couldn't function the way that, you normally would be able to. And I felt like, why am I here when my mind isn't here? And it doesn't feel right to not, just be grieving and take that time to grieve. I think that in a lot of, different parts of Mexico, you're allowed to grieve. And like people where they were Black for a long time, or like they say prayers for a couple months, like stuff like that. And to feel like here, like you just have to get right back to work and stop talking about it and pretend like nothing happened. That is another big part I think that messed me up, because I also felt like, okay, like I need to get back to it, like obviously people are like, oh, why aren't you feeling better? Why aren't you done grieving yet? And grief doesn't work like that. There is definitely no timeline for grief. Everyone experiences it differently, and everyone has their own different timeline. And I think that, like I said, mine was really, the initial period was really extended. And then even now, there are days where I'm still grieving, and I wake up and I'm just like, today is one of those days that I feel like I'm grieving still.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing that up, because that is the truth. Whenever you go to counseling for grief, and let's say it's been prolonged, so you have not allowed yourself to really process grief on its own, usually your counselor should tell you or let you know that you're going to resurface it like if it happened yesterday, because you have not known how to cope with it. You haven't brought it up. You push it to the side, and now you have to push it in front of you and deal with it. And so you might cry. You might feel sentimental all over again. People around you are going to be like, what is going on?
Yeah,
like, didn't your dad die some time ago? Like, why are you now just acting this way?
I think that happened to me a lot. And I think it's funny
For
now.
reals?
But like I would be at work and I would just start crying. And one of my coworkers was really cool, and he would come out and be like, come to my office and hide, for as long as you need. And he wouldn't question it. But like, I know the people around me were like, what the heck? Why is she just sitting at her desk crying, I think that happened to me a lot, and it resurfaced like that for me for a long time until I felt like I could think about it without crying.
Yeah.
And it feels hard. It feels like, oh, I'm never going to be able to think about this or bring it up without crying, but you'll get there. Even now, like I'm proud and I'm glad that, like, even though the pain is always going to be there, like I can talk about it without getting super, without crying my eyes out. It's always sad. It's always difficult, but it doesn't feel impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good for you to get to a point where you recognize, like, I need to have a healthy relationship with what I've gone through and not allow it to, like, overcome me. And you kind of mentioned your coworker playing some part of a support system. Did you have a support system?
No, I definitely didn't. I lived in Austin and I had my best friend there, but that was it. And I was also going back home, but my mom was grieving, really like a lot. And I felt like, okay, I have to be strong, when I'm here with her, because she's obviously not dealing with it well. And my brother, like I said, he kind of hid away and like didn't even want to talk to us for a long time. So I didn't feel like I had a support system.
How did that feel for you, not having a support
Oh
system?
my God, I don't think I've ever felt more alone in my life. I don't think I've ever felt that level of loneliness. Of course, I'm really grateful that I had good friends, but they weren't physically there, and they couldn't be, obviously, at the time. But not having someone just kind of to hug at times, like that was really hard. And I know that was hard on my best friend too, because she was busy too. And there were some days where I just feel like I just feel like I need a hug, and like I couldn't explain it. I couldn't stop crying. But definitely not having a support system also affects your grieving process. I think I'm sure that it is much easier when you have someone that's there for you.
Yeah.
At the time, like when my dad's service happened, like my friends were there, and I'm really grateful that they were able to be there. But everyone has to go back to their life and go back to work. And again, it's that part where you're like, I can't just go back to living my life normally.
Yeah.
And you don't want to bother people, because you're like, oh, it's been 2 weeks. Oh, it's been a month. I don't want to bother this person again for the 20th time and tell them like, hey, I'm not doing so well today. Do you have, 5 minutes to talk to me or anything like that? Because then you feel like a bother, and especially like in a culture where you're supposed to be helping and not bother anybody, you don't want to be that person.
Yeah. So like kind of staying out of the way and not having to open up and stuff like that. And I'm sorry you had to experience that on your own. And that is really hard, especially when sometimes maybe you hope that, why isn't this person here? Why isn't this person stepping up? Or like these people should have been here, or just always questioning maybe the whys of like how things happened. And I'm happy you were able to get help. I think most importantly out of everything, you were able to get help.
Yes, me too. I'm really glad that, I was able to decide that I wanted to go down that route and not, the other one. I'm grateful that I'm here. I'm really happy that I'm here and I'm in a good position, mentally. And it took a lot of work. It takes a lot of therapy. And sometimes it takes antidepressants to get here. But I think that it is proof that you can get to the other side. And now I feel like, even though grief is always going to be hard and, you're always going to experience different kinds of losses, I think that I can handle it better this time around than I did that first time. Again, I was also really young. I was 22, and you don't really expect to lose a parent at 22.
Yeah.
And I think that played a big role. My brain was still developing. I was still figuring out who I was. I was barely growing up, and I had to do all of this,
And so what, as we're coming down to the end of our conversation, what is something that you would like to leave our audience with? What is something about your journey that you feel can really help somebody that's going through grief?
I really want people to know that no one can tell you how to grieve, and no one can tell you to stop grieving. Nobody knows what's going on inside of your head. And I don't think that it's fair for anyone to get in the way of your grieving process or tell you that you have to get over it. You have to be okay. You have to get right back to living your life, because that's just not the reality of it. That's just not how it's going to go down. And you may feel different for a very long time before you start to get to the other side of it and start to think, okay, I think I can, deal with it. I think I can manage it now. I think that it's hard when we live in such a society and a culture that doesn't support mental health, that doesn't really know too much about grieving. And I think that that's when we need our community, when we need our people around us to support us. And I hope that everyone has that. I know that like I said, for myself, I didn't have that. And I encourage you to reach out to, you know, either a professional or to someone that you really trust, and let them be there for you. Because these are the times when you need people. You know, we may feel like a bother, but that's not fair, because we know at the other side of it, you would be there for somebody who is also grieving. And so they should be there for you. And you shouldn't feel guilty for that. You shouldn't feel guilty for grieving as long as you need to. And taking that time for yourself.
Yeah, and a lot of self-care.
Lots of self-care.
And yeah, what did your self-care look like?
At the time, it looked like wine and weed, which probably wasn't a good thing. But then
2 W's.
then it looked like the gym. It looked like being more active in my community. It looked like hanging out with friends again. And I got a second job as a waitress just for fun and to be out, you know, socially. And that really helped a lot. So it looks different for everybody. And again, I started taking care of myself. I started taking my health very seriously, because part of it was too, like, I had a fear that, like, oh, I don't want to, you know, die young too, you know, and I have to take my health very seriously. And I changed my diet and everything 100%.
Yeah.
And to this day, you know, I take it very seriously, for sure.
That's good. That's good. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your testimony. It's definitely not something that is easy. And even I'm heartfelt by it, because grief is something that is very difficult to navigate, and it's always going to look different, even if you experience it over and over again. But that's right. Like, you do have to search for the help if you feel like you need it. And there's not a means to end without, like, looking for more. And we are in such an age of technology where take that into curiosity. Like, why am I feeling sad? Like, because I be Googling everything. I be
I'm on TikTok for everything.
I'm like, TikTok, Google. I'm like, why am I feeling sad today? Why is my period
And
acting funny?
it's comforting, though, to know, oh, other people are going through this, because obviously other people have Googled it. Other people have made TikToks about it. Like, you also know, like, oh, I'm not alone. Like, I'm not crazy, you know?
Yeah, we're not crazy.
Yeah.
We're just trying to figure it out. So definitely, like, just be curious about your mental health. If there's something that is out of the normal that you're experiencing, that you're like, okay, something is up, like, be curious about it. Try to seek some answers. Go to your primary physician, even telling them and starting there, be like, hey, I am not feeling great. I'm not feeling well, even if it's mental health. It doesn't have to be a physical injury, a mental injury. That is something very much real. And then they can help send you to the specialty that you need for the type of symptoms that you're having. But get some help, y'all. Like, there is more to it than just sitting there in that loss. And you can sit there for a long time, but how long are you going to allow it to keep controlling your life, or letting it keeping you captive? Because that's what it is. You're letting yourself be kept captive in this moment.
It consumes you, for sure,
consumes
you know, and it comes to a point where you got to make that decision. Like, am I going to just let it consume me, or am I going to be proactive about it and work through it?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for
I
having me.
appreciate you.
I'm grateful to be here. Thank
All
you.
right, bye, y'all.